So I want to kind of move on to, I know this sounds like I'm calling out people or like I'm criticizing people and stuff, but I just have to call things the way they are. There is a video on YouTube by a guy who calls himself the karate nerd or something like that. And some of the stuff was interesting, honestly. And I mean, I don't know how much of this is just sort of ignorance, and I've said before, ignorance is not stupidity. And how much of this is, what they call clickbait, which is, you're monetizing your channel, and the more, controversial stuff you put out, people click. And some of it is just, I guess, not having training in historical methods, the vigorous methods of discerning fact. But this thing kind of annoyed me on a couple of different levels, and it basically was the claim that the high kicks that you see in Japanese karate came from French Savate. And along the way, made a bunch of statements about how Savate evolved out of fencing, and it's wrong in a bunch of different methods, and I put this out, but now I'm going to put it into the podcast for the listeners of the podcast if you didn't see it in writing. Savate doesn't evolve out of fencing, it evolves alongside fencing. So in other words, picture, if you will, in your right hand a sword. Depending upon the school, your left hand would maybe have a dagger. If it didn't have a dagger and you're fighting with just one sword, you're attempting, obviously, to kill the person with the sword because it's a weapon and it's the most efficient way to kill somebody. Your other hand is there to try to catch their sword arm or disarm them potentially. And for example, while you're doing this, you may want to do motions that would unbalance them to make them fall on the ground. Maybe then they would, you'd have an opportunity to stomp on them or to stab them and kill them. Create unbalance where when they try to catch their balance again, they're open to be stabbed or slashed or hacked at with a sword. But certainly when you make a clash where like you clash your swords together. So my free hand is going to grab their hand that has their sword. At the same time, their free hand is probably going to grab my hand that has a sword because they don't want me to clash the blade, grab the arm that has the sword, then pull that sword back and cut them or kill them. So now we have both of our hands occupied. I would, again, by the same token, not pull my hand off their sword arm to try to punch them or poke them or slap them because I'd be letting go of their sword arm and they could then use their sword to counterattack. Theoretically, you could use headbutts if you weren't wearing armor. And there is some of this, especially when we look at some of the older fencing, and I don't mean sport fencing, I mean fighting with swords literature. But one thing there's quite a lot of is kicking. Kneeing the groin, kicking the shins, stomping on the knee, sweeping, stomping on the shins, sliding your foot down the shins. In the West, the European, the English school, a lot of cross and then immediately either headbutt or knee to the groin. But the French school had a lot of low line kicking. And so what Savate originally was this low line kicking. It's apocryphal whether they took away the swords or not. It's also apocryphal whether they used open hand or closed fist initially because of something about the Napoleonic Code. I'm not going to get into that. But I can tell you that for a long time, Savate was considered something that ruffians and criminals and undesirables used. Low line kicking. Not high kicking. Low line kicking. So, you're going to talk about original Savate. Original Savate was more like the Okinawan low line kicking than it was like what they're saying is the high kicking that supposedly the Japanese stole their kicks from. Well, where did the higher kicking come from? Well, I mean, again, just like in Chinese martial arts, if you read my history book, people wanted to take Savate and, wash the reputation, clean the reputation of it so that it wasn't, the thing only done by criminals and lowlives. And so, for example, if you really talk to French people, they won't use the term savate. They use boxe français, French boxing. And that was part of that movement to take it away from that term. I knew a guy who was Corsican, and of course he liked using savate because he says that was the real stuff, and the French boxing later on was just cleaning it up. French boxing first, for example, because they didn't have swords anymore. Well, they'll start adopting English boxing. So they started putting gloves on and using English boxing strikes. And so, to a certain extent, also, they started to try to mirror the English boxing strikes with the kicks. And remember that the English boxing that they were absorbing at that time period was Marquess of Queensberry above the waist boxing, where there were no strikes below the waist. And so then if you're going to be mimicking that, your kicks are going to come up. And coincidentally, at this time, there is the Marseille school of Savate, Marseille being on the Mediterranean coast, the southern part of France, and it is a major port where sailors there who came into port were using a style of savate with higher kicks. But when you start looking at where those sailors were, pulling in for ports of call, it's late and I'm stuttering. They were going to Asia. They were going particularly to central and northern China and some contact with the Korean Peninsula. Now, Taekwondo is a whole other story. It's basically Shotokan. I don't want to get into that on this podcast. But one of the reasons that they were able to pull off the Taekwondo as Korean martial arts because Taekyun, which is an ethnic, a native form of Korean martial art with a lot of kicking, which is what Taekwondo tried to become to kind of obscure its Japanese Shotokan karate origins. But there was certainly kicking in the Korean Peninsula. How much of that kicking was natively Korean? How much was influenced, borrowed, stolen from northern China, being just right next to northern Korea and next to across the water from Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and how much it's a combination of the two is subject to debate. But there's no question that there are high kicks. There's this absurd person on Facebook right now saying that there are no round kicks in Chinese martial arts, and we posted literally like 50 or 60 examples of it, and then it becomes, that's more recent. Well, I'm sorry, we don't have any video of Ming practitioners. So in other words, you have to kind of if you want video, it has to be relatively recent. If you want pictures, it's still going to be relatively recent. We can give you the names from the Ming, in the early Qing period, but then you go, well, that kick is not really what I'm talking about. There's tons of kicks: hook kicks, high side kicks, flying kicks, spinning kicks, roundhouse kicks in central northern China and in the Korean Peninsula. And it appears that the Marseille school of Savate, which influenced boxe français in general, acquired these kicks from these sources. So they were not French kicks. They were kicks that were already in Asia. So why would the Japanese have to borrow French kicks when Japan was right next to it? I'm getting to that too. I mean, karate originally Okinawan karate, and and this guy cited Okinawan karate as the difference between Okinawan and Japanese not having a lot of high kicks. Well, Japan is not Okinawa, and Okinawa is not Japan. And again, there could be a whole podcast just on these differences. But Okinawa for a long time was independent of Japan and had an extensive relationship with Fujian China. The martial arts in Fujian tend to kick low, so that if they were bringing Fujianese martial arts to Okinawa and influencing their fighting methods, and you would expect that they would mostly be lower kicks. But Japan is, geographically more north. It is closer to the Korean Peninsula. It is closer to northern China. There have been extensive relationships between the Korean Peninsula and northern China and Japan for a very long time. But then, of course, 1895, Japan seizes Taiwan, and 1910 they seize the Korean Peninsula. But again, there's all this interchanging. So, to say this is just the kind of things that just sort of boggle my mind. In 1868, there was a French mission, in other words, some advisors, military advisors, to Japan. But then the person said, well, this influenced Funinkoshi's son. Well, that's 1868. Funinkoshi's son was not even born until 1905. So already you have some time issues. In that interim period, the French, as military advisors, fell completely out of favor. There is a mountain of literature on this stuff. The German method, German military gymnastics took over. The Chinese used it. There's just mountains of documents on this. The Japanese used it. There was no kicking in German military gymnastics. There was boxing and wrestling. And some people feel that boxing and wrestling, Western boxing and wrestling, influenced Chinese martial arts, for example, because of the bringing in German military gymnastics instructors. And also some of the things that we call Qigong now may actually be German military gymnastics, which were influenced by Swedish gymnastics, which came from exercises that fencers did, Perdeling. I've talked about this before. So there was no French influence among the people, making karate Japanese. There was no French influence. They were there in 1868. Most of this was done in the 20s and the 30s, leading up to the war period. And then, he brings up, well, look at these books with all these flying kicks and kicks that weren't originally part of it. And those were from the 50s, those books. And a lot of those books were Oyama books. Now, we talked about Masayama a lot because he's a very important figure. Masayama, despite his Japanese name and being one of the most important figures in Japanese martial arts, is ethnically Korean. And there is no question that he learned some Korean martial arts and integrated Korean martial arts into his karate, particularly kicks. So, remember, Oyama is the one that convinced karate people they should be sparring, which I don't know why. I don't have the answer. I can tell you that Koreans have always been fixated with sparring as part of their martial arts. I mean, again, if you look at Taekyon was not just a martial art. In fact, it was not really considered a martial art as much as it was considered like a folk kind of thing. Sort of the way that Shui Jia had sort of folk methods too. It was a thing that peasants were doing. It was a contest that included wrestling and kicking. And it sounds a little weird, but it is. So, there was definitely kicking in Korea. And again, those contests were like sparring. Koreans always liked sparring. Masayama, being Korean, wanted to spar with Japanese karate. If it was not for Masayama, Japanese karate would not do sparring. It just is. Also introduced a lot of these kind of kicking techniques. So, you can't say that an 1868 French mission to Japan is the source of these kicks when you have Koreans like Masayama and other Koreans that, were in Japan and coming over to Japan. And you had Japanese people as part of the occupation of Korea and Taiwan and again, in Taiwan, there's a lot of long fist and higher kicking techniques, You can't discount all that. It's ludicrous. And you can't say it's Savate because that's not what Savate is. And just stuff like this just drive me nuts.